This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagen. Hello, and welcome to Never Close the Inquiry. I'm your host, Nick Hagen. I'm a former Wall Street lawyer who believes that our approach to politics isn't just dumb, but damaging, with unwanted, avoidable consequences we see locally in our families, neighborhoods, communities, and states, and, of course, nationally. Here and in the companion newsletter, which can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com, I or we all together try to push back on black and white, us versus them thinking in politics and make an explicit, sustained effort to understand where people are coming from and why in their own terms. If you approach this as a conservative, I want you to come away understanding a bit more about why your liberal neighbors believe what they believe and do what they do. If you approach this as a liberal, vice versa. I want you to come away understanding why your conservative neighbors believe what they believe and do what they do. If you can't stand President Trump, I want you to get a real sense of why many people don't just stand him. They manage to stand him, but they follow him. And if you think he's a generationally good president, I want you to come away understanding why others so vehemently think he's generationally bad. But why? Why do I care? Why should you care? Why can't we all just get our news from one of the fun existing categories of news givers and talk abouters? Liberals who think conservatives are ruining everything, that's one. Conservatives who think liberals are ruining everything, that's two. Former liberals who think liberals are ruining everything, that's three. Or former conservatives who think conservatives are ruining everything, that's four. And those pretty much are the categories. So why does that matter? Well, the end result of this segregated media ecosystem is that a great many people on both sides of the political aisle end up utterly mystified as to how people on the other side could choose or think something so plainly incorrect, and are left with no option but to conclude that, your least favorite Americans are stupid, evil, operating in bad faith for selfish purposes, or some combination of all three. They are left with little but contempt for those who believe and act differently. Forget for a moment whether that's a problem in and of itself, although I think it is. It creates problems in our politics. Democrats have held the presidency, the House, and a filibuster proof majority in the Senate for 894 out of the last 20,482 days. That's since Lyndon Baines Johnson left office. Over the same period during which Democrats have had that trilogy for 894 days, Republicans zero. So, yes, with a simple majority in the Senate, which Republicans now have, parties can use budget reconciliation, a topic we'll get to another time, to pass significant legislation. But budget reconciliation is limited. And as soon as a unified government is lost, Obama, Trump during his first term, and Biden each enjoyed 2 years of being able to pass something without bipartisan support. Once you lose that, most major legislation is dead on arrival. Why? There certainly aren't any structural barriers. Congress is still free to pass laws at any point it decides to do so. Well, it's my view that as the nation is polarized, Congress is polarized. And as Congress is polarized, it has lost much of its ability to legislate, to respond to the people it purports to represent. As we polarize, we elect people that are further to each side. They can't work together, yada, yada. Congress can't do anything. As a result, more and more of the burden of governance has fallen to the president. What Republicans are experiencing now, the glorious highs of a fresh presidency, although there have been, I don't know if hiccups is the right word, over the last week. But anyway, the glorious highs of a fresh presidency and the hope of conservative dominance for years to come, that might be nice, but much of it is an illusion. Every president since Gallup started conducting polls during the Truman presidency has gone through real periods of unpopularity besides Eisenhower and Kennedy. That's 60 years. Politics is a fickle, profoundly difficult business where much for what the government is judged and the president is judged is outside its control, and parties just don't stay in charge all that long. In January 1983, Reagan was polling at 35%. If the election had been held then, hard to imagine that he wins. 22 months later, when the election was actually held, he was up to 61% and predictably won, well, somewhat predictably, won 525 electoral votes and 58.8% of the popular vote, without, mind you, coming close to Republicans winning the House. 8 years after that high point of electoral dominance, Reagan won all but one state, Bill Clinton won the presidency. Democrats took 57 seats in the Senate and 258 in the House. Power in our democracy changes hands. Trump's success as a second-term president, or the longevity of that success, will be measured in large part by how well he is able to work across the aisle. Just as he reversed so much of what Biden had done, much of which reversed what Trump 1.0 had done, a future president can and may do the same to him. The longest lasting changes come not from the president, but from Congress, and to a degree that is perhaps a little bit sad, from the court. But enough about the national implications of this. An impotent legislature that leads to an ever-increasing decline in institutional trust, which further threatens the stability of those institutions, which leads to ever-increasing frustration not just with our government, but perhaps even with our form of government. What about the personal implications? What about our communities and neighborhoods and friend groups and families? To be clear, I don't think that we are going to magically change the national political situation overnight, just not going to happen. But I will plant my proverbial flag on believing that what we do individually still matters and has real substantive value, that our relationships have substantive value. So, what do we do? There is more that unites us than divides us. So, 1,000 times you've heard the phrase or some version of it. It's everywhere, from inaugurations to convocations to commencements to campaign speeches. Whether it's meant seriously or not, its implication, as I understand it, is that we as human beings and Americans, whether we're of different races, genders, religions, political ideologies, or any and all of the above and more, have so much more in common than we realize, and that it's through focusing on those commonalities, not our differences, that we strengthen our individual and communal relationships and improve the state of our politics. Respectfully, I think there's a better way. I have a close friend on the political right. Sorry. So that sounded like a confession. For the record, I have plenty of friends on the right. Okay, you know what? A little more background on me first. I am from Utah, and my family on both sides, and now even in marriage, is from Utah and Georgia. I am a moderately dirty lib, but I have never been in the position where I wasn't close geographically and close relationally to rock-ribbed conservatives. That said, that doesn't mean I didn't go through a nice long stretch kind of thinking conservatives were a few cards short of a full deck or a few arteries short of a full heart. I'm not sure the metaphor works, but you know what I mean. I thought conservatives were mean and didn't really think about it too much further. But over time, that changed. To make a long story short, it clicked that most people, myself included, just didn't really have a great idea as to why their ideological opponents believed what they did, and most of them hadn't either hadn't made the effort to figure it out or didn't have a good idea as to how they'd go about doing so. Many of the weak conservative arguments I heard growing up came from people who had seemingly never met a Democrat. Their assumptions about liberals and liberals' intentions were really, really off. It's not that these people were dumb, or even that their criticisms of Democratic policies didn't have merit, but their views of Democrats and Democratic policies were often based on weak caricatures that an actual Democrat might not even recognize, let alone affirm. Then I went to law school and practiced at a large Wall Street firm for the better part of a decade. And it turns out that a whole bunch of liberals are just as off going the opposite direction, just as off, and for more or less the same fundamental reason. I have dear friends in New York that have never knowingly spoken to a flesh and blood social conservative. No matter how smart you are, there is someone smarter than you that disagrees with you completely. It's worth asking why. Back to my friend. So, I have a close friend on the political right with whom I regularly speak about politics, with a special focus on what's different in the way we look at things. We started these conversations not long after Trump won election to his first term. Each of us sincerely wanted a better understanding of why people on the other side believe what they believe. And, funnily enough, I think we're as close as we are now, not despite this approach, but because of it. We go through periods where we speak often and at length, and periods where conversations are more rare and brief. But when we talk, it is frequently about the moment's most controversial subject, whatever is least likely to facilitate polite conversation in mixed company. When this whole years long discourse began, we were a little more tentative. After all, how many people have friends on the opposite side of the aisle with whom they talk about politics on purpose? The number isn't zero, but as a percentage, I don't think it's very high. I think it's probably more common for people to have friends with whom they have a tacit agreement not to bring up subjects X, Y, and Z, or with whom they'll go along and smile to keep the peace if something does come up, no matter how annoyed they might be getting on the inside. This series of conversations with my friend started with friendly curiosity, almost as if we were each conducting our own science experiment. How can this person whom I like and know to be intelligent believe such nutty things? Side note, it's okay to think your ideological opponents are nutty. Maybe they are. And frankly, it's fun to think you're right and people who vote differently are dumb, are off their rockers. There's a reason such a high percentage, and it's a very high percentage, of the most popular political commentators and publications are firmly entrenched on one side of the aisle, even if they claim that they are telling you the unvarnished truth. There's an enormous amount of evidence that people want that message, that they're right and their opponents are wrong, and all the better, quite possibly stupid and or evil. Back to my friend. So we would talk and talk and talk, each of us thinking at first that we'd move the other and gain a convert. On that, we could hardly have been more wrong. Years into this, I don't think either of us has moved his feet more than an inch. We certainly haven't changed our votes. That said, what has changed fundamentally is the way we look at each other and the way we look at other Republicans and Democrats, respectively. I think that's more significant than changing votes, as fun as that might be. And I don't just mean that in a kumbaya and now we can all be Americans together sense. First, remaining actively curious and earnestly seeking to understand the best and the worst and the in betweenest arguments on the other side of the aisle makes it easier to make friends and easier to form communities. Contempt is poisonous. It closes us off, makes us shut down lines of communication, makes us narrow the confines of our tribe. The antidote, in my mind, genuine, unending curiosity. Okay, so this one, that might have been a little more kumbaya. Second, and I repeat this one from time to time, it's much easier to make winning arguments if you truly understand the person with whom you're arguing. If you're a liberal practicing your arguments on liberals or a conservative practicing your arguments on conservatives, you're signing up just to be another ship passing very angrily in the night. This is big. None of this project, none of the podcast, the newsletter, none of it's about false equivocation, saying, we're all the same for the sake of sameness or radical, reactionary centrism or anything like that. No, maybe we are, maybe we aren't. I'm not saying that everyone is the same or that no one is in the right or wrong, but one, you might be wrong. And two, if you want to make convincing counter arguments to the other side's arguments, you're going to have an easier time if you actually understand those arguments in their terms. Third, and as far as the nation is concerned, most importantly, developing the ability to engage with your ideological opponents with an open mind makes it a heck of a lot easier to work together, even if you don't, change your ideology, and on average is going to improve the quality of your solutions. I think we all understand in theory that we only have a part of the full picture, that we're not seeing everything, but do we really understand what that means in practice? Let me give you a real world example. In Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, author David Epstein wrote of Alf Bingham, who in the spring of 2001 was vice president of research and development strategy at pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly. That spring, Bingham collected 21 problems that Eli Lilly's chemists, all of whom were highly educated, highly specialized, and well resourced, had been unable to solve, and asked a top executive if he could post them on a public facing website. His theory was that outside knowledge was going to be the path to a breakthrough. After, the predictable internal haggling back and forth and whatnot, the site went live, and sure enough, a couple months later, by the fall, answers start rolling in. Heck, so one of these solutions, a molecular synthesis solution, came not from a scientist, but from a lawyer, a man whose only relevant knowledge came from working on chemical patents. It wasn't like the Eli Lilly employed scientists weren't smart. They were probably smarter and certainly had more subject matter expertise than the people sending in the answers. It was probably, I think, that they were kind of locked into a relatively narrow way of looking at things, much like a Republican or a Democrat might be, to pick some random example. Why would we expect the same concept not to work with politics? It does get complicated when we're talking about elected officials who, for worse or worse, tend to be worried about things besides just solving problems like, I don't know, winning primaries and putting together good clips to be used in fundraising emails. But on an individual level, with family, friends, or strangers online, give it a try. When my friend and I talk about a particular issue, our focus tends to be threefold. First, what is actually happening? What are the facts on the ground as best as we can understand them? Second, how does each of us look at it ideologically? Ideology is important. We're not saying you need to forget your ideology. So, what's our starting point? Is there anything one of us hasn't considered? Third, given those factual and ideological priors, how do we actually come up with a fix? We are consistently surprised not just by how often, but by how quickly, from our two opposite sides of the voting booth, we're able to come up with a solution that both of us can support wholeheartedly. I don't think it's right to say that we're compromising. It's that each of us is genuinely trying to see and is willing to accommodate competing interests that, without these conversations, we might not even know existed. And that's what this is about. If you listen to this podcast and read my newsletter, you will be challenged. You'll be confronted with arguments you have not heard before, made by people who do not agree with you. I think our families, neighborhoods, local communities, and eventually country will be stronger if we all learn to embrace and enjoy this practice. If we learn to spend more time listening to others explain why they're right than telling them that they're wrong. If that sounds appealing to you, keep listening, keep reading. If it doesn't, keep listening and reading anyway. As much as others believe they're right about their respective points of view and approaches, I believe I'm right about this, and I'd like you to give me a chance to prove it. And with that's the introductory episode. There's there are going to be some big interviews. There are going to be some episodes that are just me talking. Some episodes that are hopefully me talking to somebody else where it's not really an interview. You're just kind of having a conversation about what's happening in politics, and we'll all get a chance to learn and grow together and figure out what's going on with our nutty neighbors. And that is today's show. Thanks for listening. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com.